Welcome to the History Maps podcast. Consider the reality of a farmer living on the Korean peninsula in the year 1232.
Right.
You are standing in your own fields looking at the grain you have spent, the entire season cultivating, and you are holding a torch.
Yeah, a very grim scenario.
The state has just issued this draconian order.
Yeah.
You are to burn your crops, abandon the only home your family has ever known, and flee up into the mountains or out to the coastal islands.
Exactly.
And you are doing this because your government, the royal court, and the military elite have entirely evacuated the capital. They have barricaded themselves on an island.
Leaving everyone else behind.
Right. They left you behind because a massive, highly disciplined army of nomadic cavalry is cresting the horizon. And your leaders have decided that the best way to fight them is to leave them an empty, scorched wasteland.
It is a profoundly bleak reality, and it's the exact situation that initiated one of the most grueling, protracted conflicts in medieval history.
Right.
When we analyze the interactions between the expanding Mongol Empire and the Goryeo dynasty throughout the 13th century, we are looking at a conflict landscape that utterly defies standard military models.
It's not a standard war at all.
No, not at all. We are looking at a 30-year war of absolute attrition.
And that is the core of our analysis today. We are looking at a period spanning from 1231 to 1259.
Which is a critical era in our East Asian history series.
Exactly. We have a deep well of historical accounts, military treatises, and architectural records to sort through today. And our goal in this deep dive is to reconstruct the complete narrative of how Goryeo survived the Mongol war machine.
Right, because they do survive, but the cost is just, well, it's difficult to quantify.
It really is.
Yeah.
We will get into the specific mechanics of the siege warfare, the devastating demographic collapse, the architectural ingenuity that arose from the ashes, and the complicated geopolitical aftermath.
There's a lot of ground to cover.
For you listening, we are going to break down exactly how geography, a rigid social hierarchy, and sheer human endurance dictated the fate of the Korean peninsula.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this. The Mongols are often framed as an unstoppable force, but the Goryeo dynasty holds them off for 3 decades.
Which is a significant anomaly for that time period.
Right. Before we even get to the invasions, what is the internal state of Goryeo? I mean, what kind of government is actually running things when the Mongols first appear on the radar?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the Goryeo dynasty in the early 13th century was not a unified, cohesive state operating under the absolute authority of a king.
It wasn't.
No, it was profoundly fractured.
Yeah.
Since 1170, Goryeo had been ruled by a rigid military dictatorship.
Okay.
The civilian aristocracy, the scholars and bureaucrats who traditionally managed the state, they had been violently purged from power decades earlier.
So it is essentially a military junta.
Precisely. And by the time we reach the period immediately preceding the Mongol invasions, this junta is completely dominated by one specific family.
The Cho clan, right?
Yes, the Cho clan. King Gojong, who officially reigned from 1213 to 1259, was essentially a hostage in his own palace.
Just a figurehead.
Exactly. The real power, the policy decisions, the taxation, the military strategy, and the control of massive private armies, all of that resided entirely with the Cho family.
Got it.
This internal structure is the absolute foundation for everything that happens next.
Why is that so critical, though? Does a military junta fight differently than a civilian government?
It dictates their primary objective. For the Cho clan, the survival of the state was strictly synonymous with the survival of their regime.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, they prioritized maintaining their grip on power over the broader welfare of the populace. And meanwhile, as they are managing this internal control, the geopolitical map surrounding them is being violently redrawn.
Right, because Genghis Khan unites the Mongol tribes in 1206.
Yes.
And the Mongols do not just stay on the steppe. They immediately turn their attention southward, specifically toward the Jurchen-Jin dynasty.
And the Jin dynasty was the dominant power in northern China and Manchuria at the time.
They were massive, right?
Absolutely. They were a massive, agriculturally rich and militarily formidable empire. Goryeo actually had a long-standing, albeit very complex, tributary relationship with the Jin.
So the Jin are basically acting as a shield for Goryeo.
Essentially, yes. The Jin functioned as a massive buffer state between the Korean peninsula and the nomadic tribes further north.
But then the Mongols arrive.
Right. And as the Mongol war machine systematically dismantles the Jin dynasty, that buffer completely collapses.
And when a massive empire collapses, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It creates shockwaves.
Exactly. The immediate shockwave for Goryeo was a massive refugee crisis.
Right.
Between 1216 and 1219, remnants of the Khitan Liao dynasty, who had previously been subjugated by the Jin and were now fleeing the Mongol advance, they crossed the Yalu River into Goryeo territory.
And we are not talking about a few stragglers here.
No, not at all. We are talking about tens of thousands of Khitan refugees, and that included heavily armed soldiers.
So how does the Zhou regime handle an influx of tens of thousands of armed refugees crossing their northern border?
Well, initially, they attempt to manage it diplomatically.
Which makes sense.
Yeah, they shelter some of them, perhaps calculating that these Khitans could serve as a useful buffer or, an auxiliary force against other regional threats.
But that probably doesn't work out.
Logistics quickly dictate the outcome. You cannot suddenly feed 90,000 displaced people in a mountainous region that already has very limited agricultural surplus.
Right, the food runs out.
And when it does, the Khitans, facing starvation, begin raiding Goryeo settlements, they start seizing territory, and they essentially begin functioning as an invading army.
So it turns into a massive internal security crisis for Goryeo.
A huge one.
And this is the exact point where the Mongols actually enter the Korean peninsula for the first time. But they aren't invading Goryeo, are they?
No, the first contact is actually a joint military operation.
Okay.
A pursuing Mongol army allied with Eastern Jurchen forces who had already submitted to the Mongols, they crossed the border into Goryeo. Their objective was just to eliminate the Khitan threat.
So they team up.
They do. In 1219, a combined force of Mongols, Jurchens, and Goryeo troops, the Goryeo forces were commanded by General Kim Choryeo. They corner the remaining Khitans at a place called Kangdong.
And they successfully crush the Khitan forces there.
They do.
So on paper, the Mongols in Goryeo just executed a highly successful allied military campaign.
Right.
You would think this establishes a functional, maybe even friendly diplomatic relationship.
Well, in the Mongol worldview, there were no equal allies.
Of course.
There were the conquered, and there were those who had submitted to become vassals. The Mongols viewed their military intervention at Kangdong not as a favor between neighbors, but as a demonstration of their absolute military supremacy.
They showed up and said, look what we can do.
Exactly. And immediately after the battle, they demanded that Goryeo enter into a formal tributary relationship as a strictly subordinate state.
I was looking at the historical records regarding these tribute demands, and the sheer volume of goods they asked for is staggering.
It really is.
In the year 1221, the Mongols demand 10,000 otter pelts and 2,000 bolts of silk. How does a medieval state even source 10,000 otter pelts on demand?
They often couldn't, and that was precisely the point.
Wait, they knew they couldn't pay it?
Mongol tribute demands were intentionally designed to be onerous. They were economic extraction, yes, but primarily they were stress tests of political compliance.
I see.
The Zhou regime deeply resented these demands. They were accustomed to managing their northern borders through a delicate balance of diplomacy, minor tribute, and robust border defense.
They weren't used to just handing over massive segments of their national wealth.
Right, especially not to a newly arrived nomadic power.
So this tension builds for a few years, and then it snaps in 1225. A Mongol envoy named Chukuyu, who's also referred to as Goryeo in Korean sources, he is traveling back from the Goryeo capital to Mongol territory, and he is murdered.
And the circumstances surrounding his death were highly contested.
What was the official story?
Well, Goryeo officials claimed that independent border bandits were responsible.
Oh.
But the Mongol Empire, which was now under the rule of great Khan Ogedei, who succeeded Genghis Khan, they refused to accept that excuse.
They didn't buy the bandit story?
Not at all.
Yeah.
They held the central Goryeo government directly and completely responsible.
Because in Mongol law, diplomatic immunity is sacred.
Right. It was one of the absolute pillars of the Yasa, the Mongol legal code. Murdering an envoy was not just an insult, it was an act of war against the Khan himself.
It was a point of no return.
Exactly. It provided Ogedei Khan with a formal casus belli, a definitive justification to authorize a punitive expedition.
I have to pause here and look at the strategic logic of the Goryeo leadership. You have this ascendant empire that is actively obliterating the most heavily fortified states in the world. They are tearing apart the Jin dynasty.
Yes.
It is akin to watching a bulldozer flatten the entire city block next to you, and then you decide to throw a rock at the driver's windshield.
That is a very apt analogy.
Why would the Zhou regime risk antagonizing them over an envoy and a tribute payment?
It is easy to look back and see it as suicidal, but Goryeo was caught in a severe diplomatic and internal bind.
How so?
Externally, they still maintained ties with the faltering Jin dynasty. The Jin provided them with military intelligence and technological exchange.
So they didn't want to burn that bridge.
Right. Submitting fully to the Mongols meant severing those ties and accepting an unequal, highly extractive relationship.
And internally?
Internally, the Zhou dictators derived their entire political legitimacy from projecting unwavering military strength. Yielding to nomadic demands without a fight would fatally undermine their authority over the civilian populace, and more importantly, over rival military factions.
If they look weak, they get overthrown.
Exactly. They calculated that their northern fortress network, which had successfully repelled massive invasions in the past, could withstand the Mongol cavalry.
So Ogedei has his justification.
He does.
But the Mongols do not just march blindly into unknown mountainous territory. How do they actually plan the logistics of moving an army into the Korean peninsula?
They need a guide. They need someone who understands the terrain, the fortress network, and the supply lines.
And they find one.
Tragically for Goryeo, they get exactly that from the inside.
This brings us to the first invasion in August 1231. Ogedei Khan orders Marshal Saratai, also known as Sartak, to lead the invasion.
Yes.
The Mongol vanguard crosses the Yalu River, and they are immediately aided by a Goryeo general named Hong Bok-1, who defects.
Which was a massive blow to Goryeo's defense.
Why would a high-ranking general betray his own command like that?
The historical records point to survival and intense factionalism. The military junta was not monolithic. There were deeply disgruntled officers within the ranks. Hong Bok-1 calculated that the Mongols were going to win.
He wanted to be on the winning side.
Exactly. And by surrendering early and providing Saratai with vital logistical intelligence, he secured a highly favored position for himself within the new Mongol administrative structure.
His defection allowed the Mongols to rapidly bypass minor defenses and seize crucial border fortresses like Iju and Anju.
It accelerated their advance significantly.
But this rapid advance hits a massive, immovable obstacle. They arrive at the siege of Kuju, sometimes recorded as Kusong.
Yes, Kuju.
The records we have on this specific siege provide an incredibly detailed look at medieval warfare. You have a Goryeo garrison of roughly 5,000 men, commanded by General Pak So and General King Gyeongsun.
Right.
And they are holding out against a Mongol force of at least 10,000.
Which is a heavy numerical disadvantage.
When I think of the Mongols, I picture highly mobile horse archers sweeping across open plains. How do they handle a heavily fortified stone castle?
Well, the Mongols were incredibly adaptive. By the time they reached Goryeo, they had incorporated thousands of conscripted siege engineers from China and Central Asia.
So they weren't just guys on horses anymore.
Not at all. They possessed a highly sophisticated understanding of siege mechanics. At Kuju, they did not just surround the walls and starve the defenders. They initiated a massive active engineering assault.
Let's break down exactly what that means. What are they deploying against these walls?
The primary artillery of the era was the traction trebuchet.
When I hear trebuchet, I instantly picture the massive wooden machine from medieval European history with a giant wooden box full of rocks dropping to launch a boulder.
Right, that is a counterweight trebuchet.
Okay.
The Mongols at Kuju were using traction trebuchets. Picture a tall, sturdy wooden frame acting as a fulcrum for a very long lever arm. Instead of a heavyweight on the short end, you have dozens, sometimes hundreds, of soldiers holding ropes attached to that short end.
Wait, human power?
Yes. On command, they all pull down simultaneously with immense force. The long end snaps forward, launching the projectile.
So it relies entirely on synchronized human muscle power.
Exactly. They are less powerful than counterweight trebuchets, but they can be constructed rapidly. They are highly mobile, and crucially, they have a very fast rate of fire.
Because you don't have to crank a heavy box back up.
Exactly. The Mongols set up lines of these machines and subjected the walls of Kuju to a continuous, rapid-fire bombardment of boulders.
And they are not just throwing rocks. The sources mention they are using siege towers, scaling ladders, and they attempt to tunnel underneath the walls.
They threw everything they had at it.
But the detail that stands out the most is their use of incendiary weapons. The records specifically mention firebombs containing liquefied human fat.
Yeah, the Mongol military doctrine was brutally pragmatic.
Not a very diplomatic way of putting it.
In a siege, fire is one of your most potent weapons. They used human fat because it burns at an extremely high temperature, it is viscous, and it is notoriously difficult to extinguish with water.
So it's functioning similarly to pitch or early formulations of napalm.
Precisely. They launched these flaming projectiles, specifically targeting the wooden gates and defensive superstructures of the fortress.
The psychological terror of that is hard to fathom. You are on a wall, boulders are constantly smashing into the masonry, and you are being showered with unquenchable fire made from the remains of the people the Mongols killed in the surrounding villages.
It was designed to break their will.
How does a garrison of 5,000 hold out against that?
They hold out through highly disciplined, highly innovative countermeasures.
What did they do?
General Pakson did not just sit behind the walls, he orchestrated an active defense. When the Mongol bombardment breached a section of the wall, the Goryeo defenders rushed into the gap under heavy fire.
Just ran right into the breach.
Yes, using chains and timber to quickly erect makeshift barricades. They actually hauled their own traction catapults up onto the ramparts to return fire, targeting the Mongol siege engines.
And when the Mongols pushed those massive wooden siege towers up to the walls to drop troops onto the parapets, what do the defenders do?
The defenders utilized battlefield forges. They superheated iron until it was molten, carried it to the embrasures, and poured it directly down onto the siege towers.
That is intense.
It was highly effective. It burned through the protective hides and incinerated the structures.
So they're fighting fire with liquid metal.
Exactly. Furthermore, General Kim Kyung's son organized specialized, highly trained militia units known as Pyolcho.
Pyolcho. What were they?
These were essentially early special operations forces.
What was their role during the siege?
They conducted night sorties. Under the cover of total darkness, these Pyolka units would slip out of the fortress gates, silently navigate through the Mongol siege lines, sabotage the trebuchets and siege towers, kill the sentries, and retreat back behind the walls.
All before the Mongols could react.
Right. Before the Mongol cavalry could mobilize a counterattack, it severely disrupted the Mongol timetable.
And how did they deal with the human fat firebombs?
The defenders mixed mud and water, plastering it over the wooden structures to smother the flames. Water alone wouldn't work, but the mud choked out the oxygen.
They keep this up for 30 straight days.
An incredibly long time for a siege of this intensity.
And ultimately, Saratai, the supreme commander of the Mongol forces, realizes he cannot break Kuju.
He hits a wall, literally and strategically.
He makes the decision to completely abandon the siege. He leaves a blocking force and just bypasses the fortress entirely, marching his army southward toward the capital, Kaesong.
It highlights a crucial limitation in Mongol military doctrine.
Which is?
Their absolute supremacy lay in rapid mobility, flanking maneuvers, and drawing enemy armies into open field engagements.
But when faced with rugged, mountainous geography and heavily fortified strongpoints manned by resolute infantry,
their mobility was completely neutralized. They were forced into a grinding war of positional attrition, which negated their primary tactical advantages.
So Saratai bypasses Kuju and threatens the capital. The Goryeo court, realizing the open countryside is lost, sues for peace.
Yes, a treaty is signed.
The Mongols agree to withdraw their main army, but they leave 72 Daragachi administrative overseers stationed in the northwest to ensure the tribute flows, and Goryeo complies.
The conclusion of the first invasion presents a deep irony.
How so?
The Mongols won the campaign in a macro sense, right? They forced the Goryeo government to capitulate and sign a treaty, but they comprehensively failed at the major tactical objective of Kuju.
So the Goryeo leadership learned a specific lesson from that.
Exactly. For the Cho military regime, this outcome provided a very specific lesson. Their fortresses could withstand a direct Mongol assault.
And that lesson heavily influenced the disastrous strategic decision they made next.
It certainly did.
Because the peace treaty of 1232 demanded immense tribute. Thousands of horses, otter skins, bolts of silk, and the presence of those 72 overseers.
A huge economic drain.
But the Cho regime never intended to honor this long term. In 1232, the military dictator Cho Yu executes a plan that fundamentally alters the trajectory of the war.
He does.
He orders the royal court, the central government, and the elite aristocratic families to entirely evacuate the capital of Kaesong and relocate to Ganghwa Island.
Ganghwa Island is located in the estuary of the Han River, just off the western coast of the peninsula.
Why Ganghwa? To understand why this move was so significant, we have to look at the geography, right?
Exactly. The stretch of water separating the island from the mainland is narrow, but it is characterized by masked tidal shifts and treacherous mudflats.
And the Mongols, for all their mastery of cavalry and siege warfare, have essentially zero naval tradition.
They had none. They were masters of the steppe, not the sea. That narrow channel of water functioned as an impenetrable moat.
So they're safe.
The Zhou regime immediately began conscripting immense amounts of labor to fortify the coastlines of the island, build new palace structures, and stockpile provisions. They essentially moved the entire apparatus of the state behind a wall of water.
But the central government is relatively small.
Mm.
What happens to the millions of commoners, the farmers, the artisans, the people who actually generate the wealth of the country?
This is where the policy becomes deeply controversial and devastating. The central government issued a nationwide decree enforcing a scorched earth policy.
The one we mentioned at the start.
Yes. The mainland populace was ordered to abandon their agricultural lands, take whatever provisions they could carry, burn the rest, and evacuate to designated mountain fortresses or smaller coastal islands.
It's essentially telling the population, we are leaving, you are on your own, and by the way, destroy your own livelihood before you go.
The strategic logic was to deny the Mongols any resources. If a Mongol army marched down the peninsula, they would find no grain to feed their horses, no villages to plunder, and no local labor to conscript.
A strategy of starvation.
Yes, aimed at the invading army. But the reality was that it starved the Korean peasantry long before it severely impacted the Mongols.
Predictably, the Mongols view the relocation to Gangwa Island as a blatant violation of the peace treaty.
Of course they did.
The Goryeo envoys are executed, and Ogedei Khan authorizes the second invasion in August 1232. Seritai returns.
Saratai's forces cross the border and sweep down the peninsula. They find the capital at Kaesong completely abandoned.
They ride to the coast, see the Goryeo banners flying on Gangwa Island, and realize they lack the ships and the maritime knowledge to cross the channel.
They are completely stuck. Frustrated, Saratai orders his forces to push further south, ravaging the countryside to force the central government to capitulate out of sheer desperation.
This southern push leads to a highly significant yet deeply localized battle that completely derails the Mongol campaign.
It really is a turning point.
It happens on December 16, 1232, at the Battle of Cheongsong. Now, Cheongsong is not a massive stone fortress like Kuju. The records identify Cheon as a bugak. What exactly is a bugak?
To understand Cheon, we have to understand the rigid social stratification of the Goryeo dynasty. A bugak was a specific type of segregated administrative settlement.
Okay.
It was populated primarily by a social class known as the Chamnon.
Which translates roughly to base people, correct?
Yes. These were the absolute lowest tier of free society. They were largely agricultural laborers or manual workers who were heavily restricted in movement.
They were tied to the land.
Essentially, yes. They were barred from taking civil service examinations and burdened with the most severe taxation and corvée labor requirements. They were treated marginally better than indentured servants or slaves.
So the fortress at Cheongsong was relatively small, constructed primarily of packed earth rather than stone.
Right, it was not a primary military installation. It was a desperate refuge for these marginalized people.
So inside this earthen fort, you have roughly 1,000 refugees, mostly these low-status peasants, and a contingent of about 100 Buddhist monks.
A very small, untrained force.
They do not have elite military commanders. They elect a monk soldier named Kim Yun-hoo to lead them.
Yes, Kim Yun-hoo.
The Mongol army approaches, commanded personally by Saratai. This seems like a completely asymmetrical slaughter waiting to happen. How do they possibly fight back?
Well, Kim Yun-hoo understood that standing behind low earthen walls against Mongol siege engines was a death sentence.
It would be over in hours.
Exactly. So he orchestrated an active ambush. He leveraged his knowledge of the local terrain. The area surrounding Cheongsong featured hills and difficult, muddy approaches.
Perfect for an ambush.
Kim Yun-hoo positioned his forces, these monks and armed peasants, in concealed positions along the Mongol line of advance.
And then comes the critical moment. As Saratai is leading his forces, Kim Yun-hoo draws his bow, fires an arrow, and strikes the supreme commander of the Mongol invasion force.
A perfect shot.
Saratai drops dead. What happens to a Mongol army when the supreme commander is killed in action?
It causes an immediate catastrophic systemic failure.
Really? just from one guy.
Yes, you can think of the Mongol command structure like a highly centralized server network.
Okay.
Every individual unit and commander was directly networked to the supreme leader. Their authority, their orders, and their unit cohesion emanated directly from his presence.
So when he dies,
When you unplug that central router when Saratai dies, the entire network crashes.
the chain of command instantly fractured.
Completely. Without a designated successor on the field, the various subordinate commanders lost cohesion, morale plummeted, and the entire Mongol invasion force completely collapsed and initiated a rapid withdrawal from the Korean peninsula.
I have to pause and look at the social dynamics at play here.
It's a striking contrast.
The contrast is staggering. The royal court, the elite generals, the people whose explicit societal role is to protect the nation, are hiding behind water and walls on an island.
Right.
Meanwhile, the absolute lowest tier of the social hierarchy, led by a monk, is left in a mud fort on the mainland, and they're the ones who managed to kill the supreme commander of the Mongol army. How does the central government process that?
What's fascinating here is how it exposed a profound contradiction within the state. By ordering the evacuation to mountain fortresses, the central government essentially decentralized the defense of the nation.
They force the locals to fend for themselves.
They inadvertently empowered marginalized, heavily oppressed communities who suddenly proved highly capable of defending their own territory and achieving massive tactical victories.
Did the government acknowledge this?
The historical records indicate the central government recognized this, albeit awkwardly. They offered Kim Yun-hoo a prominent official military rank as a reward.
But he refuses it initially, right?
He does. He reportedly claimed that he did not even have a bow and arrow during the battle.
Why would he say that?
This could be interpreted as monastic humility, deflecting glory, or perhaps it reflects the complex, strained relationship between these marginalized defenders and the elite government that had abandoned them.
Like, I don't want your medals now.
Exactly. However, the government did elevate the administrative status of Cheon. They removed the Bugok designation, effectively freeing the residents from their segregated low-status classification.
That is significant.
It demonstrates how wartime service and extreme crisis could occasionally force cracks in the rigid social mobility of Goryeo.
But the victory in Cheongsong only bought Goryeo time. It deeply embarrassed the Mongol Empire, but it did not deter them.
No, it just made them angrier.
It ensured that when they returned, they would return with a strategy focused not just on submission, but on systematic devastation. This initiates the longest, most destructive phase of the conflict.
Between 1235 and 1251, the Mongols launched the third and fourth invasions.
And their strategy fundamentally shifted.
It did. Since they could not cross the water to capture the leadership on Gangwon Island, they decided to completely dismantle the economic and cultural foundation of the mainland.
They systematically ravaged the agricultural heartlands of the Gyeongsang and Jeolla provinces.
The accounts from this period are horrific. It was not just the burning of grain silos. The Mongols engaged in a deliberate campaign of cultural and spiritual annihilation.
Let's look at 1238. The Mongols march into the old capital of Gyeongju and burn down the 9-story wooden pagoda at Hwangyongsa Temple. What was the significance of this specific structure?
The pagoda at Gwangyangsa was arguably the most iconic architectural marvel on the Korean peninsula.
How old was it?
It was constructed centuries earlier, in 646, commissioned by Queen Seondeok of the Silla Kingdom, and designed by a master architect named Abichi.
And it was huge, right?
It stood roughly 80 meters tall, an absolutely massive structure built entirely of interlocking timber without the use of iron nails.
80 meters, no nails.
It was a symbol of national longevity and spiritual protection.
Yeah.
And the Mongols burned it to the ground.
And they did not stop there. They also marched on the Temple of Winsa and burned the storage halls containing the first edition of the Tripitaka Koreana.
The Tripitaka was a massive collection of Buddhist scriptures carved onto wooden blocks. The first edition had been created in the 11th century, specifically commissioned to invoke divine spiritual protection against the Khitan invasions.
So by targeting the pagoda and the Tripitaka, the Mongols were engaging in psychological warfare.
Exactly. They were attempting to break the historical continuity and the spiritual identity of the Goryeo people.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The mainland is literally burning. The agricultural base is collapsing. And the central government, sitting on Gangwon Island, decides to initiate a project that requires a staggering amount of resources and coordination.
It seems counterintuitive.
They decide to carve the Tripitaka Koreana all over again.
It is one of the most remarkable acts of cultural defiance and preservation in human history. The creation of the second Tripitaka Koreana, known as the Palmin Daejonggyung, spanned from 1237 to 1251.
Who funded it?
The project was heavily funded by the Cho military regime. They appointed a highly respected Buddhist scholar monk named Sugi to supervise the endeavor.
And Sugi does not just rush out a copy. He conducts a massive scholarly review.
He was incredibly meticulous. Sugi collated the text of the older Goryeo version, the Northern Song Dynasty version, and the Khiten Liao version.
He's basically doing academic peer review in the middle of a war.
He cross-referenced them to correct omissions, fix errors, and ensure absolute textual accuracy before a single block was carved.
Let's talk about the physical mechanics of this project, because the scale is difficult to process. We're talking about 81,258 individual wooden blocks.
It's an immense physical undertaking.
Each block is roughly the size of a large rectangular serving tray and weighs between 3 and 4 kilograms.
Yeah.
You do not just chop down a tree and start carving.
No. The engineering and material science behind the wood blocks is extraordinary. They primarily utilize silver magnolia wood, harvested from the southern islands and coastal regions.
Okay.
The preparation process took years. First, the logs were submerged in seawater for roughly 3 years.
Wait, seawater? Why salt water?
The salt water effectively neutralizes the natural resins in the wood and kills any dormant insects or larvae.
Oh, that makes sense.
Through osmosis, the salt replaces the moisture in the wood, which prevents the wood from warping or cracking when it eventually dries out.
So they soak it for 3 years. Then what?
After 3 years in the ocean, the logs were boiled in fresh water to clean them, and then placed in heavily shaded, well-ventilated areas to dry for several more years to ensure the core was completely stabilized.
That is years of preparation before a single letter is carved.
Only then were they handed over to the master carvers.
It is a massive industrial undertaking,
Huh.
but what is equally impressive is how they preserve these blocks. Today, these 81,000 blocks are housed in the Jangyeong Panjin depositories at Heinze Temple, deep in the mountains.
That's right.
The architectural design of these buildings is a masterclass in pre-modern climate control.
The depositories were engineered specifically to protect the wood from humidity and extreme temperature shifts.
How did they do that without electricity?
If you look at the buildings, you will notice the window placements are highly specific. On the front of the building, the lower windows are large and the upper windows are small.
Okay.
On the rear of the building, it is the exact opposite. Lower windows small, upper windows large.
How does that regulate the climate?
It creates a natural wind tunnel effect, utilizing the specific wind patterns coming down from the Gyeongsang Mountains.
I see.
The air enters the large windows, compresses as it moves through the racks of wood blocks, and accelerates out the smaller windows,
Creating constant airflow.
creating constant, gentle ventilation that prevents the air from becoming stagnant and damp.
And the floor is not just paved stone, right? The builders excavated the earth and laid down specific layers: charcoal, salt, lime powder, and sand.
They utilize the principles of hygroscopy. The salt and charcoal act as natural desiccants.
Like the little packets you find in shoeboxes.
Exactly. During the humid summer monsoon season, the floor naturally absorbs excess moisture from the air. During the dry winter months, the floor releases that moisture back into the environment.
Maintaining a highly stable internal humidity.
Because of this engineering, the wood blocks have survived in pristine condition for over 800 years.
But we have to ask the critical question. While the mainland is suffering total war, why does the military dictatorship allocate massive amounts of labor, wood, and funding to carve religious texts?
It stems from the concept of protective Buddhism, or Hoguk. In the Goryeo worldview, carving these blocks was not merely a scholarly exercise or a preservation effort.
It wasn't just to have a copy.
It was viewed as a literal, tangible defense mechanism. The act of carving the sacred texts was considered a massive national petition to invoke divine intervention.
So it was essentially a weapon.
They believed that mobilizing this immense spiritual energy would compel the heavens to repel the Mongol invaders, just as they believed the first Tripitaka had protected them in the past.
So they're consolidating this massive spiritual defense on the island, but the physical reality on the mainland reaches its absolute breaking point.
Yes.
This brings us to the fifth invasion in 1253, led by Prince Yeku and a ruthless general named Jolertai.
The campaigns conducted by Gellertai between 1253 and 1258 represent the absolute nadir of the conflict.
It gets worse.
Much worse. The Mongol objective shifted from seeking diplomatic submission to total demographic erasure. They sought to render Goryeo biologically and economically incapable of sustaining any further resistance.
We do still see isolated moments of intense resistance, though. In December 1253, the Mongols lay siege to the Cheongju mountain fortress.
Right.
And the commander of the defense is Kim Yenhu, the exact same monk who killed Saratai 20 years prior. He is now leading the defense here.
He's back.
After 70 days of constant siege, the fortress runs out of food. The defenders are starving, morale is breaking, and the fortress is on the verge of falling. Kim Yenhu makes a highly radical sociological decision.
He gathers the defenders, and he orders the slave registries to be brought out and publicly burned.
The physical documents that bind the lowest class to their servitude.
Yes. By burning the registries, he legally and symbolically destroys their subordinate status. He promises that anyone who fights to defend the fortress, regardless of whether they were born a slave, a peasant, or an aristocrat, will be granted freedom and an official government rank.
How does the garrison respond to that?
The promise of freedom is an incredibly potent motivator. The exhausted defenders rally. They launch a desperate, coordinated counterattack and successfully break the Mongol assault, forcing them to retreat from Cheongju.
That is a notable victory.
It is a profound example of how extreme existential pressure forced temporary suspensions of Goryeo's rigid social hierarchy. However,
Let me guess, it wasn't enough.
while these localized victories are inspiring, they could not stem the massive tide of Gellertai's broader strategy of devastation.
The historical records attempt to quantify the sheer scale of the destruction, and the numbers are difficult to process.
They are grim.
In the year 1254 alone, the records state that Gellertai's forces took 206,800 Korean captives back to the Mongol Empire as slaves and laborers.
And that is just the number of captives. The overall demographic estimates are devastating.
What are we looking at?
Historical analysis suggests that by the end of the conflict in 1259, upwards of 46% of the Goryeo population had perished.
Almost half the population. How does that practically happen?
It is a combination of factors. There is the direct warfare and the massacres of cities that refuse to surrender. But the vast majority died due to the systemic collapse of the agricultural cycle.
Because everyone is hiding.
The Mongols burned the fields, and the Goryeo government ordered the peasants into the mountains where they could not farm. This caused widespread, catastrophic famine.
And famine brings disease.
Whenever you have massive displaced populations suffering from severe malnutrition, lethal epidemics inevitably sweep through the camps.
How does a state continue to function when half of its population is dead or displaced?
It simply cannot. And this demographic collapse is the exact mechanism that forced the end of the war.
The Cho regime finally breaks.
The Cho military dictatorship's entire strategy of holding out on Gonghwa Island was built on a massive logistical flaw.
Which was?
They relied entirely on taxes, grain, and resources extracted from the mainland to provision their island fortress and maintain their private armies. But with the mainland reduced to ash, the population halved, and agriculture non-existent, the economic foundation of the regime completely evaporated. They ran out of money and food.
And when a military dictator runs out of resources, he runs out of friends.
Exactly. The devastation completely erodes any remaining support for the Cho regime. The civilian officials, and more importantly, rival military factions, realize that continuing this war means absolute annihilation.
So they turn on him.
In May 1258, a military officer named Kim Chun orchestrates a coup. He assassinates Cho U, the final dictator of the Cho lineage.
Just like that.
This singular violent act ends 60 years of continuous military rule in Goryeo.
With the Cho clan removed, the political landscape shifts immediately. The literati faction, the civilian scholars and bureaucrats who had long favored a negotiated settlement, regain influence over King Gojong.
They recognize that submission is the only viable path to survival.
In May 1259, the Goryeo court formally capitulates to the Mongol Empire.
Yes, the official end.
To seal the agreement, they send Crown Prince Wangchuan as a hostage to the Mongol court, signaling their absolute acceptance of Mongol suzerainty.
So the central government officially surrenders. But that does not mean the violence stops immediately.
Right, we get this fascinating and deeply tragic epilogue to the resistance. the Sambyolcho Rebellion.
Crown Prince Wangchuan returns from the Mongol court and ascends the throne as King Wanzhong in 1260. He accepts the stringent Mongol terms.
What are the terms?
He agrees to dismantle the heavy fortifications on Ganghwa Island and orders the central government and the royal court to return to the mainland capital at Kaesong.
And the Mongols take territory, right?
Yeah. Furthermore, the Mongols establish direct administrative control over vast swaths of northern Goryeo territory, setting up the Sangsong and Dongyang prefectures.
But the military units that have spent the last 3 decades fighting a brutal war against the Mongols violently reject this peace treaty.
They refuse to accept it.
This sparks the Sambyolcho Rebellion, which runs from 1270 to 1273. Who exactly were the Sambyolcho?
Sambyolcho translates to the 3 elite patrols. They were the premier military force of the deposed Cho regime.
So they were the elite bodyguards.
They were the heavily armed enforcers who guarded Ganghwa Island and executed the anti-Mongol operations. When King Wanzhong ordered the return to the mainland and submission to the Mongols, the Sambyolcho understood exactly what that meant for them.
They were marked men.
Under a Mongol-dominated civilian government, their power, their status, and likely their lives would be forfeit.
So they refuse the royal decree. They revolt, they seize control of the ships and supplies on Ganghwa Island, and they actually elevate a distant relative of the royal family to act as a rival monarch.
Yes. But they recognize that they cannot hold Ganghwa Island against the combined forces of the Mongols and the pro-surrender Goryeo army.
So they run.
They need distance. You can think of their retreat like a cornered animal climbing to the highest branch of a tree. They are safe for the moment, but they have nowhere left to run.
Where do they go?
They sail south, establishing a base on Jindo Island. When that position becomes untenable, they retreat even further south to Jeju Island, far off the southern coast.
On Jeju Island, they construct the Hangpaduri Fortress and attempt to establish a maritime anti-Mongol state. They harass coastal shipping and try to rally anti-Mongol sentiment on the mainland.
But the resources of the Mongol Empire are essentially infinite.
In 1273, the final blow falls. A massive combined armada carrying 12,000 troops assaults Jeju Island. And the tragic irony here is the composition of that armada. It is not just a Mongol force. It is a combined force of Mongol soldiers and Goryeo government troops.
Yes.
The Goryeo military is ordered to fight alongside the enemies they battled for 30 years, to hunt down and exterminate their own elite defense force.
It is a brutal illustration of how protracted civil conflicts often resolve. The Sambyolcho Rebellion represented the final desperate gasp of the military regime's anti-Mongol policy.
The combined forces breach the fortress, and the rebellion is crushed.
To solidify their control, the Mongols actually appropriate parts of Jeju Island and convert them into massive pastures for breeding their war horses, integrating the island directly into the Mongol military supply chain.
With the Sambyolcho destroyed, all resistance is crushed. The 30-year war is over.
It's over.
But the consequences for Goryeo are just beginning. For the next 80 years, Goryeo operates as a vassal of the Mongol Yuan dynasty. The historical records describe this relationship with a very specific term. Goryeo is classified as a son-in-law kingdom, or kurigan. Let's break down what that means. So what does this all mean? Does being a son-in-law to the emperor offer a privileged status, or is it just a gilded cage?
This raises an important question because it is a deeply complex political arrangement. Goryeo's status was highly anomalous within the Mongol Empire.
How so?
If you look at the Jin dynasty or the Southern Song dynasty in China, they were completely dismantled, their royal lines were ended, and their territories were directly annexed.
But Goryeo wasn't.
No, Goryeo retained its monarchy, its geographical borders, and its core administrative identity. But this survival required immense sacrifices and autonomy.
The term son-in-law kingdom refers to a mandatory policy of royal intermarriage.
Yes.
Starting in 1274, when the Goryeo king Chungyel married the daughter of Kublai Khan, the successive kings of Goryeo were required to marry princesses from the Mongol imperial family.
Exactly.
How does that affect the day-to-day governance of Goryeo? Are these princesses just symbolic figures sitting in the palace?
Absolutely not. These Mongol princesses held immense, tangible political power within the Goryeo court. They brought their own massive retinues, their own wealth, and they operated with the absolute backing of the Yuan emperor.
So they were basically shadow rulers.
In many ways, yes. Princesses like Kuatluk actively dictated domestic policy, manipulated the selection of high-ranking officials, and engaged in fierce, sometimes violent power struggles with the Goryeo kings themselves.
And the integration goes deeper than just marriage. The future kings of Goryeo do not grow up in Korea.
No, the crown princes were required to reside in the Yuan capital of Beijing as hostages during their formative years.
To ensure loyalty.
Right. They were educated entirely in Mongol customs, they often adopted Mongol names, wore Mongol clothing, and they served as officers in the Keshig, the emperor's elite imperial bodyguard.
By the time they returned to the Korean peninsula to ascend the throne, they were deeply culturally and politically integrated into the Mongol imperial system.
Completely assimilated.
Beyond the royal family, how does the Yuan dynasty enforce control over the broader Goryeo state?
Institutionally, the Yuan established a permanent oversight body in 1280 known as the Branch Secretariat for Eastern Campaigns.
Eastern campaigns implies they're looking beyond Korea.
They were looking at Japan.
Oh, right.
Initially, this secretariat was established to coordinate the massive logistical undertaking required for Kublai Khan's invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281.
And the burden placed on Goryeo for these campaigns was staggering.
Goryeo was ordered to conscript tens of thousands of soldiers and sailors. They had to strip their forests to provide the timber to build hundreds of massive warships in a matter of months.
And both of those invasions fail catastrophically. The Mongol fleets are decimated by typhoons, famously known as the kamikaze, or divine winds, combined with fierce Japanese coastal
The
defense.
campaigns failed, taking thousands of Goryeo conscripts to the bottom of the sea.
But even after the plans to conquer Japan were abandoned, the branch secretariat remained in Goryeo.
It transitioned into a permanent administrative body staffed by Yuan appointees who constantly monitored the Goryeo king, dictated economic policy, and ensured the massive flow of tribute continued.
We discussed the economic tribute earlier, the silk, the pelts, the grain. But during this 80-year period, the most agonizing form of extraction was human tribute.
It was devastating.
The records indicate that roughly 2,000 Goryeo women were forcibly sent to the Yuan court.
The tribute of women generated immense social trauma and deep resentment among the Goryeo populace and the literati elite. Scholars like Yi Jae-hyun wrote passionate memorials protesting the practice, highlighting the devastation it caused to families.
Yet, human history is complicated, and this forced migration actually created highly unexpected avenues of political influence.
It did.
Some of these women, who were sent as low-ranking palace attendants or concubines, navigated the incredibly dangerous politics of the Yuan court and rose to positions of massive power.
The absolute pinnacle of this phenomenon is Empress Ji.
Empress J.
She was sent from Goryeo as a tribute woman, but through immense political acumen, she became the primary favored empress of Togon Timur, the final emperor of the Yuan dynasty.
She wielded extraordinary political command, dictating policy across the empire from Beijing.
Yes.
And she actively influenced the culture of the Mongol elite, right?
Yes. Because of her influence, Goryeo customs became highly fashionable within the highest echelons of the Yuan court. Mongol aristocrats began adopting Korean clothing styles, hairstyles, and dietary preferences.
It was a fascinating reverse flow of cultural influence.
And we see massive cultural exchange flowing back into Goryeo as well. Goryeo scholars who traveled to Beijing as diplomats or hostages encountered new philosophical frameworks.
Specifically, they encounter Neo-Confucianism. How does that differ from the Buddhism that dominated Goryeo?
Goryeo was heavily influenced by aristocratic Buddhism, which focused heavily on spiritual protection, ritual, and the afterlife.
Like we saw with the Tripitaka.
Right. Neo-Confucianism, imported from Song and Yuan China, was a highly structured, rationalistic, philosophical, and political ideology.
Okay.
It provided a rigid framework for statecraft, emphasizing social order, absolute loyalty to the sovereign, and bureaucratic meritocracy over aristocratic birthright.
That's a massive shift in thinking.
It provided the intellectual tools that the reform-minded scholars needed to begin dismantling the old, fractured systems of the Goryeo state.
And while the elites are debating philosophy and adopting Mongol hairstyles, the core cultural practices of Korea continue to endure and evolve.
The creation of world-renowned Celadon pottery, the continuation of their agricultural practices, the preservation of the Tripitaka blocks the underlying identity, survives the occupation.
The period of Mongol overlordship was an era of intense forced extraction, deep political humiliation, but also massive cultural cross-pollination.
It forced Goryeo out of its isolation and integrated it into the largest contiguous land empire in human history.
This period of subjugation only begins to unravel in the 1350s. As the Yuan dynasty begins to fracture internally due to massive peasant rebellions in China, King Ganmen of Goryeo seizes the opportunity.
He pushes back.
He initiates a purge of the pro-Yuan factions within his court, uses his military to push back the Mongol garrisons, and reclaims sovereignty over the northern territories.
It's the beginning of the end for Mongol rule.
We have covered an immense expanse of history today, tracing the journey from the arrival of starving Khitan refugees through 3 decades of horrific siege warfare, the mobilization of monks and marginalized peasants, the carving of the Tripitaka, and finally the complex 80-year era of the son-in-law kingdom.
It's a staggering narrative.
But before we finish, I want to leave you with a concluding thought that builds upon all of these sources. If you look at Goryeo before the Mongols arrived, it was a deeply fractured state.
It was.
It was controlled by a selfish military junta, and regional power was decentralized among entrenched aristocratic families who cared more about their private estates than the nation.
The profound existential pressure of the Mongol invasions forced a fundamental shift.
Right.
The sheer necessity of coordinating a defense and surviving a total war demanded centralization. Furthermore, the subsequent 80 years of integration into the Yuan dynasty forcibly introduced the rigid, highly structured, Neo-Confucian administrative models from Beijing.
Exactly. The Mongol invasions physically shattered the old aristocratic, fragmented structure of the Goryeo dynasty.
They burned away the old systems.
And ironically, that destruction inadvertently laid the administrative, social, and ideological groundwork for the highly centralized, heavily bureaucratic state that would eventually emerge from the ashes in 1392, the Joseon dynasty.
Yes.
The unstoppable force of the Mongol Empire did not just break the immovable object of Goryeo, it forced it into a crucible, melting it down and forging it into an entirely new, highly organized state structure, one that would endure for the next 500 years.
It is a profound demonstration of how the most catastrophic conflicts often construct the architecture of the future.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.